In this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, we take up a piece of the action.
Compliance, the final frontier. Tom Fox is the voyager of Trekking Through Compliance. His mission? To explore the original series and seek out and share what it can teach you about compliance. Here's your host, Tom Fox.
Trekking Through Compliance, episode 46, a piece of the action. In this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, we consider the episode A Piece of the Action, which aired on January 12, 1968, stardate 3211.7. Story synopsis. The crew of the Enterprise attempts to make contact with the inhabitants of the planet Sigma Iotia II, and Uhura puts Kirk in communication with the boss, Oxmix. The intelligence and imitative inhabitants of Sigma Iotia II have built a culture around the book Chicago Mobs of the Twenties, which was published in 1992 and which was accidentally left behind 100 years ago by the SS Horizon when they visited the planet. The Horizon was subsequently lost in space, and its report only reached the Federation 1 month previously because it was sent via conventional radio instead of subspace communication. At the time of the Horizon visit, the non-interference directive was not in effect, so Kirk, McCoy, and Spock wonder what sort of contamination they will encounter when they beam down to the agreed rendezvous point, a city intersection next to a yellow fire hydrant. Upon arriving, they are held at gunpoint by Oxmix's men, but are taken to safety by the boss after a machine gun attack by his rival boss, Krako. Oxmix reports that there are a dozen or so bosses across the planet, each controlling his own territory. He asks Kirk to supply him with weapons so he can take over the planet and becomes upset when Kirk tells him that is not possible. Oxmix has his men escort Kirk and party to a warehouse and hold him prisoner, then uses Kirk's communicator to demand that Scotty beam down a bunch of phasers within 8 hours or he will burn the landing party. Kirk wrangles out of the imprisonment by pretending to teach the Iotians the card game Fizbin. With this distraction, Kirk and Spock overpower the guards. Kirk instructs Spock and McCoy to use the radio station to contact Scotty and beam back to the Enterprise. Unfortunately, as soon as Kirk leaves the warehouse, he is kidnapped by some of Krako's men. Jojo Krako, who is the boss of the South Side, also wants heaters and instructions on how to use them and offers Kirk a third of the proceeds of their use. He is not amused when Kirk suggests a sit-down conference to discuss the planet-wide unification and has some of his men notify Cyril the Knife that he may have a job. Oxmix learns about Kirk's capture and contacts the Enterprise. By promising a truce, he gets McCoy and Spock to beam down to discuss how Kirk can be freed. After beaming down, however, Spock instructs Scotty, they are double-crossed, of course, by Oxmix, and Spock instructs Scotty to set the ship's phasers on wide dispersion stun for the region surrounding the beam-down point. As Spock suspected, he and McCoy are immediately taken prisoner. However, Kirk has been able to escape from his prison cell by pretending to be hurt, then subduing his guards. He makes his way back to Oxmix's office and frees Spock and McCoy. He also forces two of Oxmix's men to exchange clothes with himself and Spock, and the two make their jerky way to Krakow by stealing a manual transmission automobile. While staking out Krakow's place, Spock and Kirk are accosted by a young hoodlum who offers to help them make the hit in exchange for a piece of the action. He describes the men guarding the door, distracts them by pretending to be hurt. Kirk and Spock pretend to be his family and then overpower the unsuspecting guards. Once inside, however, they find that they have been expected and are covered by machine gun-wielding gangsters. Kirk convinces Krakow that the Federation is moving in and tells Krako that he will be in for a piece of the action if he cooperates. He then has Scotty beam Krako up to the Enterprise, although Scott is initially perplexed by Kirk's gangster lingo. Kirk then gives the same story to Oxmix and has him call the other bosses. Scott locates the people on the other end of the phone line and transports them to Oxmix's office. They seem to agree to unification under the Federation, which will get a 40% cut, but then demand to see proof that Kirk and company actually have some muscle backing them up. At this point, a hit begins on Oxmix's men, and Krauko uses the opportunity to again take Kirk, McCoy, and Spock hostage. He does grant Kirk one last transmission to the Enterprise, which Kirk uses to tell Scotty to stun the battling gangsters using the ship's phasers. The bosses are impressed by this display and agree to Kirk's original proposal with Oxmix as the head boss and Krauko as his lieutenant. Spock has reservations about the idea of leaving a criminal organization in charge and also wonders how Kirk plans to collect the 40% cut every year, but Kirk poo-poos his objections. After the Enterprise leaves, McCoy realizes he has left his communicator behind in Bella's office. The communicator contains a translator, the integral part of all machinery found on the Enterprise, so it's very likely the imitative Iotans will have made an impressive technological process and progress the next time they are visited by the Federation. What's the fun fact from today's episode? This episode has two actions unique to all of Star Trek, the original series. This episode marks the only time in the entire Star Trek franchise that Kirk calls McCoy by his full nickname, Sawbones. Second, this is the only episode in which the ship's phasers are set to stun. Some have labeled this episode a piece of fluff, but I think there are some larger issues that you should consider. So would an entire culture be willing to throw away everything that made them unique in favor of something a group of aliens brought to them? So, for instance, do any of the Iotans feel threatened by the changes suggested or even demanded by Kirk and the Enterprise? Do they try to rebel against this tyrannization of their planet? As to people who oppose this, were they silenced, imprisoned, martyred? Would they have been? Could there exist an underground that would maintain the old ways of hits and bumps and a piece of the action? So it's interesting to think about this story in that context, but it's also interesting to think about what happens if Voyager or some other future starship visits the Iotian planet and does what Kirk suggests, come back and try to get the Federation's piece of the action. I can hardly imagine what they might find, but it might make for a very interesting episode. Today, I'd like to take things in a little bit different direction and look at the role of compliance and how it has to balance cultural preservation and progress in the face of unintended consequences, as demonstrated by this episode, A Piece of the Action. It certainly demonstrates some of the complex challenges that a compliance program must carefully navigate. So what are some of the key issues? Well, stakeholder engagement. You have to engage with local stakeholders, community leaders, and affected parties to understand their perspectives, values, and aspirations for their culture. You have to incorporate their feedback and insights into your decision-making process to ensure compliance efforts align with your cultural and community interests literally across the globe. 2, cultural impact assessments. You need to conduct a thorough cultural impact assessment before implementing any new compliance policies or indeed even having interventions. Identify potential risks and unintended consequences that could arise so that you can develop mitigation strategies. You need to continuously monitor for emerging issues and be prepared to adapt your compliance approach as necessary. Next, take a gradual consultative approach. Avoid a heavy-handed or abrupt changes that could disrupt the natural evolution of your corporate culture. Failure to implement or implementation of compliance measures in a gradual, consultative manner allows the community and your employee base to provide input and influence the pace of change. Should foster an open dialogue and collaborative problem solving with various stakeholders within your organization, including your live elements as well as those going forward. Preserve your core culture elements. Identify and prioritize the preservation of community core culture elements, traditions, and values. Develop compliance policies that protect and nurture these essential aspects and the culture while enabling an appropriate level of progress. Empower your community of employees to maintain control over the aspects of their culture they deem most important. Capacity building and knowledge transfer. You need to invest in capacity building initiatives to equip your employees with the knowledge, skills, and resources to navigate compliance challenges on their own terms. You should facilitate the transfer of relevant expertise and best practices literally to the front line, enabling a community to become self-sufficient in managing compliance matters. Finally, flexibility and continuous improvement. Regularly review and update compliance approaches to account for evolving dynamics and culture needs. Maintain flexible, adaptable mindset and be willing to course correct or pivot strategies as required. Incorporate lessons learned from previous experiences and continually improve the compliance program's effectiveness and cultural sensitivity. By adopting a balanced, collaborative, and culturally sensitive approach, compliance programs can navigate the delicate balance between preserving your culture at the local level and enabling appropriate compliance progress, ultimately minimizing unintended consequences and fostering sustainable compliance solutions on a go-forward basis. Join us tomorrow where we take up the immunity syndrome.
If you enjoyed this episode of Trekking Through Compliance, you can help it grow by sharing it with the biggest Trek fan you know.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.